As we saw in our last two installments, the distinction between sci-fi, fantasy, and horror was at one time not at all clear. During the 19th century, authors like L. Frank Baum and Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote books that straddled the boundaries between sci-fi and fantasy, while novels with a gothic character, like Hodgson's The Nightland, had SF settings as well as elements of horror. The boundaries between the three continued to blur in the 1920s, when a new venue, the Pulp Magazine, created a home for all sorts of weird fiction stories. The first of these magazines, Weird Tales, contained horror fiction like H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu stories and Robert E. Howard's Conan adventure. It also published many of the stories written by Edmond Hamilton, who wrote both pure horror and science fiction. One of his most famous stories, The Man Who Evolved, which appeared in Wonder Stories in 1931, had a premise which was later adapted by the TV show The Outer Limit. A scientist invents a ray that dramatically speeds up the evolutionary process, with the result that at each stage he becomes more cerebral. While at first he wants to use his mind to enslave humanity, he evolves past this into a benevolent being. The end of the story, though, is more typical of horror. He turns into a pool of protoplasm, while one of the two friends who have been assisting him goes mad and destroys the lab. Many of Hamilton's stories fall into the category of space opera, stories of battles and adventures set against an interplanetary backdrop. In The Star Stealers, which was published in Weird Tales in 1929, a ship serving the Federation of Stars is sent to stop aliens from another galaxy from hauling away a star to replace their own, which would place Earth and other worlds in great danger. The captain of the ship, who is the focus of the story, is dedicated, loyal, and decisive, and we don't get a sense of his emotion, and he isn't troubled by the kind of doubts that we sometimes see in more recent Starship Commander. Like most of the imaginative works we've looked at so far, Hamilton's stories don't offer any conjectures as to how technologies like intergalactic travel might actually work. But he does seem interested in telling his readers something about the astronomical knowledge of his time. You know, Ron Rarak, that the universe itself is composed of infinite depths of space in which float great clusters of suns, star clusters, which are separated from each other by billions of light years of space. You know, too, that our own cluster of suns, which we call a galaxy, is roughly disk-like in shape, and that our own particular sun is situated at the very edge of this disk. Beyond lie only those inconceivable leads of space, which separate us from the neighboring star cluster, or island universes, depths of space never yet crossed by our own cruisers or by anything else of which we have record. If we compare Hamilton with writers like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who used other planets as exotic settings the way earlier writers had used foreign countries, we can see that he treats them as real places that functioned in the same ways as Earth itself. Though the space operas of this era didn't inspire actual film, there were short serials that were shown in theaters before the main attraction. Two of the favorites were Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, but these were based not on SF stories or novels, but on comic strips. These serials were one of the main influences on what some would claim is the greatest of all space opera. The first magazine to specialize in science fiction was Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories, which first appeared in 1926. Its first issues included stories by Verne, Wells, and Poe, along with more recent stories by other authors. By the 1930s, important writers like Murray Leinster, Jack Williamson, and John W. Campbell were contributing stories and novelettes. Though Campbell wrote the novella Who Goes There, which was the basis of The Thing from Another World from 1951 and The Thing from 1982, his best-known offer is writing, but for the pulp magazine Astounding, which he edited from 1937 until his death in 1971. It's still being published under the name Analog. Astounding was intended for a more sophisticated audience than its contemporary, and instead of just adventures of the sort Edgar Rice Burroughs was famous for, its stories were meant to focus on some high-concept, thought-provoking idea. One of its best-loved stories, Campbell's Twilight, bears strong echoes of Wells's Time Machine. It's about a man from the 31st century who turns up in the present and tells the narrator that he has just returned from 7 million years in the future, when humanity is dying out after a period of great accomplishment and surviving off of the machines which their ancestors had built but which they no longer knew how to build or repair. Astounding also published in the 1940s Isaac Asimov's Foundation stories, which he later turned into books, and perhaps the most iconic SF story of the 20th century, his Nightfall, about a planet with 6 suns which only experiences darkness every 2,000 years when it brings about the end of civilization. The work of Robert Heinlein began to appear there around the same time, including his story, If This Goes On, about the revolt against the religious dictatorship which has taken hold of the United States. Another favorite is Nimsy Where the Board Row from 1943, about 2 children who disappear into another dimension after discovering a box of educational toys sent back by a man in the distant future who was testing his partisan by dumping his kids' old stuff into it. The number of novels of the period began, like Asimov's Foundation, as stories that were serialized in the magazines, such as Slum by A. van Vogt, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter N. Miller Jr., and Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. Slam, which was first published in 1940, takes place in the distant future when a group of designed people who possess both physical and mental gifts are being persecuted by a dictatorial regime that controls the entire planet. The novel seems to resemble one of H.G. Wells's social critiques, because it's interested mainly in how we treat people that are different from us, how different they can be before we stop regarding them as fellow human beings, and whether humanity can and should evolve. During the first decades of pulp sci-fi, the other major medium for describing the fantastic, the movies, was producing stories of a different sort. Instead of adapting the long, cerebral novels of the 1940s and 50s, which are now considered the golden age of science fiction, the imaginative films of the time were more interested in original stories about monsters, whether they were invading aliens, the symbolized fears of Cold War invasion, or homegrown creatures created by the atomic testing of the years after World War II. One alien invasion movie, which was unusual for its time, was The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951, in which the alien is the hero. He's much more ethical than most of the human beings he encounters, and he looks so much like everyone else that he's able to blend in and become friends with regular people. His goal is to warn humanity that they're becoming a danger to the people of other planets who may destroy them to protect themselves. Then there's The 27th Day from 1957, in which another concerned, but not altogether friendly alien gives 5 people from around the world the means to destroy humanity and a few weeks to decide where to use it. The alien says that his people need a new planet, but even though they will not hurt others to save themselves, they expect that humanity will do the job for them. In the end, it turns out that it was a test of humanity's character, which it passes by finally uniting as one people. Then there were the movies about mad scientists, which drew on novels like The Island of Dr. Moreau, in the sense that their protagonists were more interested in satisfying their intellectual curiosity than in the welfare or even the lives of other people. The terrible things they do to achieve their goals make these films as much horror as they are sci-fi, as in the case of Dr. Cyclops from 1940. Here the Doctor has found a way to shrink people, which he wants to force on everyone in order to reduce the stress on the environment. But this doesn't make him an empathetic or even an ethical person, unlike the scientists in the more recent film Downsizing. A subcategory of the mad scientist movie is about creating new life, which then goes wrong or becomes something the creator had not intended. This idea, as you've already seen, goes all the way back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in which a scientist's grief, ambition, and lack of feeling toward the creature he has created cause it to go mad and seek revenge against him. But since the monster movies of the 1940s and 50s more purely sci-fi films have been made in which its new discoveries and technique that lead to new and dangerous creation. Some of these creations are dangerous because they are both powerful and unpredictable, like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park or the xenomorph in Alien. The same thing was true of the first artificial beings in fiction, which were feared because of their strength or because they had no empathy, like the robots in the original Westworld movie, or a computer placed in charge of America's nuclear arsenal in Colossus, the Forbin Project. But as artificial intelligence became a real possibility, we began to see beings who were made to serve humankind, but begin to ask questions about their nature and their place in the world, such as Roy Batty in Blade Runner, who wants to know how long he has to live and whether he is more than the soldier he was designed to be, or Commander Data, who wants to be more human. In Steven Spielberg's AI, David knows that he isn't a real boy, at least according to the people around him, but he desperately wants to be one. At the end of Star Trek The Motion Picture, the machine V'ger merges with the human being in answer to a question expressed by Mr. Spock. Is this all I am? Is there nothing more? Modern SF has also considered, since 19th century novels like The Island of Dr. Moreau, what it means for non-human creatures to become human. One of Olaf Stapledon's novels, Curious, is about a dog which has been bred and raised to be at least as intelligent and self-aware as the people around him. Throughout his life, he wrestles with finding his place in the world. The people he lives among don't share his animal nature or the way he relates to things through smell rather than sight, while other dogs can't appreciate his philosophical side or his love of music and literature. The same kinds of challenges are faced by the intelligent ape Caesar from the original Planet of the Apes movie, who was raised as a human being who comes to see himself as the deliverer of the fellow ape. And Charlie Gordon in the novel Flowers for Algernon, an intellectually challenged adult who undergoes an experiment which quickly turns him into a genius. Charlie comes to realize how little respect he had been given before, but also that he's still the same person he was before the experiment, despite the changes in his awareness and ability. Maybe the most influential SF movie of the Golden Age was Forbidden Planet from 1956. Its setting resembles the space operas we looked at a moment ago. It takes place in the 23rd century, when the United Planets are patrolled by a fleet of starships. One of these arrives on Altair 4 to find out what had happened to the previous expedition, and we learn that the scientist who has been studying the remains of its ancient and advanced civilization has unleashed the same forces that wiped out the original inhabitants. They built a machine which turned their wishes into reality, but also manifested their violent subconscious thoughts into destructive creatures. All of these ideas would appear 10 years later in the original Star Trek. The interplanetary government, the isolated scientist in the episode The Man Trap, the alien technology in What Are Little Girls Made Of, and creatures that feed on violent thoughts in Day of the Dove. There was a closer relationship between SF literature and the TV and radio of the period. The radio program Dimension X, which aired in 1950 and 51, adapted stories like Kurt Vonnegut's Report on the Barnhouse Effect about a psychologist whose mind becomes a powerful psychokinetic force, and Isaac Asimov's first novel, Pebble in the Sky, about an ordinary man of the present who is accidentally transported to the distant future when the Earth is an irradiated backwards planet in a large galactic empire. One of these broadcasts was an adaptation of Ray Bradbury's There Will Come Soft Rain, about a mechanized house that continues on after its owners have been vaporized in a war. Let's compare the broadcast with the original story.
At 10 o'clock, the sun came out from behind the rain. The house stood alone on a street where all the other houses were rubble and ashes. At night, the ruined town gave off a radioactive glow which could be seen for miles. At 10:15, the garden sprinkler filled the soft morning air with golden fountains. The water tinkled over the charred west side of the house, the side which had been facing the blast. It was black except in 5 places. One of the 5 places was a silhouette of a man mowing a lawn, just as he'd been the instant the radioactivity burned his image into the side of the house. Over there, a woman bent to pick flowers. Still further over, their images burned into the wood, where a small boy, hands flung into the air. Higher up, the image of a thrown ball, and opposite, a girl, her hands raised to catch a ball which never came down.
This story, which contains no dialogue at all and no character, more or less reproduces the original, except for the background music and the sound effect. Though other stories like Vonnegut, which do have both characters and dialogue, expand on them while cutting out the story's narrative fiction. Given how much of the sci-fi output of the period was in the form of short stories, it makes sense that television, which produced a number of anthology series even before The Twilight Zone first aired in 1959, was more suited to dramatizing it, either through direct adaptations or by hiring SF writers like Theodore Sturgeon and Richard Matheson to produce original script. Like many of the pulp magazines, these anthologies combined sci-fi, horror, and fantasy. The Twilight Zone, for example, included among its sci-fi episodes To Serve Men, about aliens who say they've arrived to help humanity, People Are Alike All Over, about astronauts who encounter a human-like civilization on Mars, and The Obsolete Man, about a librarian who faces up to a dystopian fascist state. For fantasy, it had What You Need, about a little man who sells cheap objects which turn out to be essential, Nothing in the Dark, about an old woman who knows death is coming to collect her, and A Penny for Your Thoughts, in which a man can suddenly read other people's minds. For horror, there was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, in which a man afraid of flying is the only passenger to discover that a gremlin is going to crash his plane, and Living Doll, about a man whose little girl's talking doll decides she is going to kill him. Several of these were redone as part of The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horror episodes. One film from this period, which was more closely related to the written fiction of the time, was Destination Moon from 1950, which was partly written by Robert Heinlein. His influence shows itself in 2 ways. First, the story reflects the sort of hard SF for which Heinlein would become famous. The astronauts do a spacewalk with magnetized boots to fix a problem on the outside of their ship. One of them loses his tether and is rescued by another using a gas canister to propel him in the right direction. And when returning to Earth, they need to throw out most of their equipment because they don't have enough fuel to lift off at their full rate. On the other hand, the movie describes the plan to reach the moon as the initiative of private industry, which takes up the challenge after the government fails to complete its own project. The idea that big scientific and technological accomplishments like reaching the moon are best left to the free market had already appeared in Heinlein's early works, such as The Man Who Sold the Moon, and his ideal societies were libertarian ones. Though science fiction that is centered around some new technology or phenomenon will often take place in the future, but discoveries may also be made in the present or the near present, like Wells's Time Machine and the Time Tunnel of the 1960 TV series. These inventions tend to cause problems, even when their creators are well-intentioned. In the Time Tunnel, the travelers are sent at random from one time and place to another, and they never manage to get back home. Rather does the hero of the 90s show Quantum Leap. Doc Brown, on the other hand, does eventually get a handle on time traveling without disastrous consequences for the space-time continuum. Another kind of current or near-future innovation, which has been popular since the 1980s, is genetic manipulation, which we find in movies like Gattaca, Splice, Species, and Mimic. While the first of these is dystopian, in the sense that its hero is kept from the life he wants by his lack of genetic improvement, the other 3 associate DNA experiments with the same kinds of horrific consequences that atomic testing had in the films of the 1950s. Ever since H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, there's been a long series of stories about alien invasions and arrival, most of which take place in the present and focus on the gap between the technological and scientific accomplishment of the aliens and the human beings they encounter. As in the two films we looked at a moment ago, The Day the Earth Stood Still and The 27th Day, this gap tends to unify humanity, whose own social and technological differences pale by comparison. In the film Independence Day, the invasion leads to an international military response, and in an episode of The Outer Limit from 1963, a group of scientists try to prevent World War III by creating an alien, complete with spaceship and ray gun, to fool the world into believing that it has to unite against this threat of invasion. There are also more positive, or at least well-intentioned, cases of contact, such as Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End from 1953, in which the aliens have come to give humanity the peaceful conditions in which it can evolve into a higher form of life, though at the cost of our individuality and identity. One of the most recent contributions is the movie Arrival, in which the aliens are not so much friendly as incomprehensible, especially in the original story on which the movie is based, though by making contact, they're actually giving humanity their broader perception of reality. It's only the governments and militaries of the Earth whose fears and suspicions of the aliens and of each other threaten to derail the process. Probably the most positive visions of extraterrestrial contact are E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and the astronomer Carl Sagan's Contact, which posits a galactic civilization that, with a hug, makes itself known to developing planets so that they can eventually join the larger society. On the other hand, the traditional alien invasion trope is completely subverted by the 1976 film The Man Who Fell to Earth, in which a completely inoffensive alien arrives in order to amass a fortune so that he can bring water back to his dying planet. Though he disguises himself as a human being so that he'll be accepted, he is eventually destroyed by alcoholism, the flaws of his human friends, and the U.S. government, which treats him like a lab animal. Next time, we'll finish with SF by looking at visions of the more distant future, both utopian and not, and at the grand sweep of future histories like Foundation and Dune. Please remember to like and subscribe.